This is a preview of my Python backend course. If you'd be interested in this, check out the link down in the pinned comment or in the description. Welcome back. This episode, we're going to be talking about getting started with version control. Now, this is a category of software, but most people use Git, and that's what I would recommend. That's what we're going to be using for this course. GitHub is a website that allows you to store these Git repositories, but there are competitors out there as well, such as Bitbucket or AWS. I started on GitHub back when private repositories costed money, so when that was the case, I would use Bitbucket because it was free. However, since then, GitHub has opened up the private repositories to be free as well, so now I pretty much exclusively use GitHub. So earlier on in our environment setup, we talked about Git a little bit, so you should have Git installed, and what that means is within a terminal, you should be able to say Git and get some response of different commands you can issue. So if you don't have Git, go ahead and get it installed. You can go to git-scm.com to download it. Once you have that downloaded, what we can do is we can just X out of some of this stuff just to clear up our screen, because right now I'm just getting overwhelmed with all these words and stuff. What we'll do is we will create a repository, and the way you do that is with git init. And when you do that, some changes are going to happen over here. You see all these change to green, and you can see the different files that are now being tracked for our repository are in this little tab called source control, 5,987 pending changes. Well, that's a little insane. You can see the same thing over here with git status. Fortunately, it combines the ones such as everything in this virtual environment just in this directory, whereas this will actually list out all of the files. So this is definitely a cleaner view when you're working with tons of files, but we don't necessarily need to put everything inside of version control. So we were able to initialize a repository. However, I'm going to want to do a little extra work by setting up our config. So we'll say git config -- global user.name, and then inside of quotes, I'm going to put my name, Caleb Curry, using quotes because there's a space here. Hit enter. And then we're going to do the same thing with our email. So git config -- global user.email, and then your email address, which I already have set up. But you'll probably get a complaint about this on Windows. If you don't set your config on Mac, it'll just work with some default values, but I think it's probably good to use custom values here. Now, if you've already had Git installed before this video and you didn't get the option to set your default branch on installation, you can do that with git config -- global init.default branch, and we're going to say main. Hit enter there, and that should be all of the setup you need. So your username, your email, and also the default branch. Now, just like we had this .venv directory, there's going to be a .git directory, which isn't even shown here. But I think if we say ls-a, we can see .git. So again, the dot prefix means, hey, don't touch this file. It's hidden for a reason. So whenever we want to work with this repository, we need to be in this path, this directory. So in this case, users Caleb Curry CS files. So if we're in a different terminal window, we can issue the same stuff such as git status, and it says on branch master, which we'll change that when we push to GitHub. We'll change it to main. But in order for this stuff to work, we have to be in this directory. So if I change directory up a directory, and now I say git status, it says fatal, not a git repository or any of the parent directories. So if you're in a different terminal window, just make sure you are in the correct path right there. Now, a repository can be as modular as you want. You can have multiple projects in it, but I am of the opinion that having one project per repository makes sense. So you might have a repo for front end and a repo for back end, and any other main sections of your entire project you could have in its own repo. That's just how I do it, but you could also do it larger repositories or smaller repositories. So we created the repository. Now let's go ahead and create a readme.md file, and this will describe our project. So what we can do is we can say echo, and inside of quotes, we'll say £, which is a title, space, and we'll just say file hosting, which is kind of the idea I'm going with for this application, end quote, greater than sign into readme.md. So Markdown is a really handy markup language that allows you to describe the structure of the file. and you can say Markdown Open Preview to see what this looks like. File hosting. So this is what it's going to look like, and this will go in the repo's homepage in GitHub. So you can describe how to install your project or how to use it. Now that we have this file, we can make a commit. So to do this, we'll say git add readme.md, hit enter. And now when we say git status, you can see we have one new files that's staged to be committed, and then we have a bunch of other untracked files. Same visual over here on the source control tab. We have one staged change. So the way Git works is you have your files, your working directory, and then you can stage changes which are one step closer to being committed. So basically when you're ready for a file to be committed, you put it in the staging area, and then we make a commit, which is when we actually commit to what that file says. So as you get ready to commit, you can start adding files and prepping for that commit. So let's go ahead and take a look at committing this officially. To do that, you say git commit -m and then some description, initial commit, hit enter, one file changed, one insertion. You can see the staging area disappeared over here on the left, and we still have all of these files which were not added into the repository because I don't actually want to put 5,000 files in here. I'm going to talk about a better way of doing things here in a second. So what we can do now is say git log, and that's going to give our history of commits. Here's our initial commit. The only thing in this commit is a markdown file. So we can say, hey, we want to ignore everything inside the virtual environment directory and any other files that we wouldn't want in our repository with a git ignore file. So to do that, we can just say touch.gitignore, hit enter, and that's going to create the file over here, right here. And in here, we can put any directory or file that we don't want added to the repository, such as .venv. We'll hit save, and you can see that turned gray, and now we only have 12 pending changes. This is pretty effective to get rid of most of what we don't want. However, we can be a little bit more thorough and actually copy a gitignore template off of the internet, such as this example gitignore file from Toptal, which is linked in the notes, but you can just search Toptal gitignore for Django. That should do the trick. So we'll go over here, paste that, and that's going to cover pretty much everything. And you can find in here the virtual environments and a bunch of different other naming conventions you'll find. That's a little bit more effective, and you can see it also got rid of this PyCache folder and this DB SQLite 3. So now we only have 7 pending changes, which is a much better summary of the state of our project. So we did it from the terminal. Now let's do it from Visual Studio Code. We can go through here, and let's just do this in sections. So we'll say add git ignore. So we'll make that commit, and then we will add the start of our project. All right, there we go. We added those all to the staging area. To do the same thing in the terminal, you could say git add dot for the current directory, which will add everything. All right, so those are stage, and then we'll just say start of project. Hit the little check mark, and that's committed. So now we can say git log, and we can see a history, start of project, add git ignore, and you can use the arrow keys to go up and down, and then initial commit. So we got the basics of Git figured out. Now we need to create a GitHub account. So create one if you don't already have one. If you already have one, you can just create a repository. I'll go through that process now. So here I am on GitHub. What you can do from here is if you don't have an account already, go ahead and create one. But once you have one, create a new repository using this plus up in the corner. And we'll just say Backend Python. Now pay attention here. We want to make sure we get this right. Do you want this public or private? I'm actually going to start with private. This is what I would suggest just starting out until you really understand what you're doing. Go ahead and skip this part. It says skip this step if you're importing an existing repository. Well, we already created that repository locally, so we don't need to do any of these things. We already created a README and a gitignore, and we're not going to worry about a license right now. So let's go ahead, create repository. You can change the view of this later if you want to make it public later. So from here, we already have a repository, so we don't need to create a new one. We just need to push an existing repository from the command line. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a remote. Think of it as a remote destination for a code, which is this URL on GitHub. We're going to rename our branch to main from master, and then we're going to push those changes to the remote, which is called origin. So what we'll do is we'll just copy these lines. You can do them one at a time if you want, or just copy all 3. And we'll go over to our code, hit Q to exit that log, and we'll just paste the code here, hit enter. So now we have a main branch locally, and it's set to track the remote branch main from the origin remote. So lots of words, but you'll get used to it if you're new. So far so good. We should be able to go back to GitHub, do a quick refresh, and you can see this is our project. So now we have all of our code backed up. It's a little safer if we screw something up, and you can go in and see the commit history here. You can see it's 3 commits, which this will summarize the change. So you can go in here and see that we added all of these files, and inside of, like, say this example, this settings.py, you have a secret key. Keep the secret key used in production secret. Any kind of secret keys or, any kind of access keys, you don't want to put those up in source control and make it public. So until you have all of those hidden, you probably want it to be private. And a quick note, if a repository is private, and then let's say you remove all those secret keys and you make it public, that commit history is still there. So you'll need to refresh any keys to new values so people can't just go back to the commit history and take those values. So any API keys, you want to invalidate them and get new ones. Here's another example of a change from a different repo that I have, where someone suggested a pretty obvious name correction. Not sure how I messed that up, but that's what it's going to look like. And this is a pull request where someone suggested a change and they're like, hey, pull this change into your code. And I was like, okay, I did, and now it's better. Also be careful because pull requests can be full of a lot of junk. Here's an example where there was this day, I'm not entirely sure the significance, but some company or something was giving out free stuff for people who made pull requests. And October 1st, I was flooded with pull requests of 2020, that is, where these are really not helpful. So check out this one, improve docs. And then you can go into the file changes here. And all they did was add one line of info. I mean, nothing actually valuable. They were doing this purely for the sake of getting a merged pull request for some kind of competition or something. I'm not entirely sure. So if you're going to make pull requests, try to make them valuable. Otherwise, they're just going to sit here or be rejected. So here are some examples where I made pull requests that were mildly helpful, but not super technical, and that's fine. It doesn't always have to be some massive fix or something. It can just be suggestions on documentation. But you can go in here and see the changes. It can be multiple commits, but this is just a single commit where I just corrected the URL to make a button work. And that's how you start contributing to open source. It's really not too bad. Now when you do this, you might need to fork the repository. So when a repository is public, you can make an entire copy of it using this fork button, which is what I did. Then I had a local version of that, and I made the change, and then I went in here and added a pull request. Forking can also be handy if you want to make your own version of a project. Just be very careful with licenses. They can get you if you start making money on a project or are publishing a project as your own, so just double check the license of a repository. And as for how to do that, you can just go to the main page for that repository, and they'll have the license over here, Apache 2.0 license, which you can click and read about, or you can just get a summary right here. So this is available for commercial use and so forth. So now let's talk a little bit about how Git actually works. It takes a snapshot of your files with each commit. This is in contrast to diffs. So lots of words here if you're new to this, but basically you get a copy of your code for each commit, and it's not just a summary of the changes in the files with each commit. It's a little detail, but it makes it different than some other version control systems out there. Git will allow you to easily restore different versions. So if you need to go back and let's say you introduced a bug on a certain date, well, you can go back and figure out what was changed between different commits. And it'll basically just diff the two snapshots. Diff meaning check the difference between. So just to review, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with what the process with working with Git is, you're going to make changes to your files. You're going to add them to the staging area. Then you're going to commit those changes. And then finally, you're going to push those changes up to any remote location. So to show you that pushing process, let's go back to our code and we'll just take a look at the README because we can easily change that. We'll just say, this is going to be fun. We'll say git add readme.md, git commit, quick change, and then git push origin main. So origin is the name of that remote, and then main is the branch that we're on that we want to push. You can see right here, that's the branch we're on, which we renamed from master with some of those earlier commands we issued when we set up our repository to be pushed to GitHub. Hit enter. All right, there we go. And now we should be able to go back, and we'll go back to Backend Python and see that change. This is going to be fun. Now, the last thing I want to show you is how to clone a repository, which is a little bit different than forking a repository. Cloning the repository is going to bring down that code, not as its own project, so you can make changes to that code and then push those changes. This is exactly what you're going to be doing if you move to another machine or you're working in a team environment. So to illustrate this, I am on a new machine, and what we'll do is we'll say git clone https://github.com followed by the user, Caleb Curry, followed by the repo, which I believe is backend-python. Now, when you do this, it's going to start cloning that into a directory called backend Python, and it asks for your username, as this is a private repository, so you have to prove that it's you. So the easiest way would be to make this public, which I'll probably end up doing for this course, so you can issue that same exact command to get the repo of code on your local machine if you're interested. Public is definitely easier to work with. When you're working with private, you have to authenticate, and you might have to enable access tokens in your GitHub account, which is a little bit more complicated and out of the scope of this exact video, but I'm sure you can figure that out if you do need to clone a private repository. That's all I have in this video. We'll continue to give tips and tricks with Git as we go on through this course. But for now, stay tuned for the next episode. I'll see you there.